Hey, so we're going to transition. I'm going to invite Amy. Can you bring my notes up too? You got them, great. I'm going to invite Amy up. And so as she's coming, if you're new or if you haven't been here for a bit, we've been on this series called Building Bridges. And we're a church plant. And because we're a church plant, it affords us opportunities to try things that maybe established churches don't have always the flexibility or maybe the foolishness to try. And so today we're doing something different. We haven't done this before, but if you've been here for a while, we've been talking about at the end of the series, we're doing a question and response Sunday. And what that means is we're taking your questions and we're going to respond to them. I'm glad we're saying respond. We might not answer them, but we're going to respond to your questions because one of our values is pursue growth, and that means we want to do things that are different, things that might be things that aren't the normal, and allows us to try things. So listen, your feedback will be helpful for us because we want to know if this is actually beneficial to everyone in the different environments that we're doing this. The second reason why we're specifically doing a question and response Sunday is another value of ours is be curious. We believe healthy communities are curious ones. We believe in Metro Vancouver, we want to create a space that's safe for people to ask the big questions of life. We believe pushback, we believe questions are not threatening to us, but is actually the soil of where Jesus does some of his best work. And so we want to create a community that's curious. And so part of that is we want to create intentional times where we answer the questions that people are asking. The last thing we want to do is create content and preach on different things which is not even connecting to the real life reality of what you live day in and day out. And I don't know about you, but when I've been part of different seminars or different things like that, I always find the Q&R session at the end some of the best moments because they actually start getting to they've given their whole presentation, but you're like, yeah, but there's always that yeah, but, right? And so today we're hopefully going to answer some of those yeah, but questions. So we got a lot of different questions came in, and maybe I wasn't intentional in letting you know that this Q&R is just simply about this series around building bridges. So the last 4 weeks we've looked at a series of building bridges. How do we build bridges in becoming more of a polarized world? How do we build bridges with one another? How are relationships formed? And we looked at a vulnerable community, a diverse community, and a loving community. So our questions today that we're going to answer are going to be related around that. So I'm sorry if you asked how Amy gets her hair to look that way. We'll have to save that maybe for another week, or how you make almond milk out of almonds. Again, we're going to have to maybe shelf that for another week. I don't think we'll ever actually answer that question.
Our milk and honey series.
Yes.
That was such a Bible joke. I'm so sorry.
I didn't get it. I just said yes,
I haven't had a lot of sleep, you guys, so
I said yes.
buckle up.
Last thing, and then we're going to jump in. We're going to answer hopefully 4 to 5 questions today. We are not the experts. And in no way by us answering these questions would want to communicate that we simply know everything and we figured out all these things. We're very much in the trenches in the journey of what it looks like as discipling to Jesus and following him, how that makes sense in our day-to-day life. And so very much we're just going to speak from that place. We're going to might introduce you to some experts in some of these different subjects that have been helpful for us. But by no way would we want you to think that we are an authority or that we know all of these things. In fact, we reach out to several different individuals based on the questions that help us with some of that. Yeah. Should we jump in?
Let's do it.
Question number 1. Do you want to read it?
Question number 1. I feel like we changed the wordage. So, what role do boundaries have in vulnerability?
Okay. So what role? So a couple weeks ago we talked about vulnerability. We believe authentic community, which when I talk to most people is they want authentic community. They think actually probably a lot of problems with the church is that it's not authentic, real community. But the key to have authentic, real community is vulnerability. It's part of it. You can't have authentic community without vulnerability. But when I say vulnerability and I say, hey, take a step of vulnerability, for lots of people, there's a yeah, but, right? That's a nice ideal, but there's lots of challenges with vulnerability. Some of us have experienced those in negative ways. And so sometimes vulnerability can actually be a really damaging thing and not a beneficial thing if not in the right context. Some of you might have experienced this, that people use vulnerability to manipulate you or to around some like manipulation to kind of coerce a response out of you, right? And so sometimes vulnerability is not done in the best context. And so we want to take a bit, we're both going to talk to this about how do we create some boundaries around vulnerability. So I want to speak on one thing, and then Amy will speak on another. I think as we talk about vulnerability, we need to know what vulnerability is built on. Vulnerability is built on trust. Trust. Trust is what you need for a relationship to have a healthy level of vulnerability in it. And trust is based out of relationship with people. And relationships, well, they take time. So time creates relationships, which creates trust, which creates vulnerability, right? And so for us to say, hey, you should take a step of vulnerability, I'm not expecting that our community in February is now just in this level of like vulnerability that we never were, right? Because I know vulnerability is based out of relationships, and relationships take time. Let me give you an example. So we have a lead team, a group of individuals that help make the decisions of how we function as a church and the things that we execute and do. But we established as a lead team, one of the foundational things for us to function effectively and collaboratively is to build a foundation of trust, right? That was going to be important for us as a team. Like, we have to have a level of trust if we're going to be able to do this. And I knew what that meant. I knew that trust meant relationships, and relationships just meant time. And so we're really intentional of meeting with our team regularly, having one-on-ones or connecting with them or having meetings, and they're probably getting tired of Jordan and Amy. They're like, again? But I know that trust is a currency of relationships. And so the more interactions you have, the greater you build up that amount of trust and that currency in those relationships. And so when I talk about vulnerability, I'm not just saying someone that you meet at coffee after the service is the first person you should be vulnerable with. I'm talking about finding those people that you trust. And maybe you're not sure who they are. And so maybe it's someone that you think is someone that is trustworthy, and you take a little step and see what that response looks like, right? And so I think it would be foolish for us just to go out and share all of our dirty laundry, so to speak, with anybody at any point. But there should be people that we identify as trustworthy and that we connect in that way. Brené Brown, who has written more about trust than anyone else, or vulnerability, than anyone else, she has this great acronym that's helpful where she establishes what makes a trustworthy person. Because when I say, hey, you should be vulnerable with someone you trust, and you're like, I don't know if that person is trustworthy or not. Well, Brené, she helped us with her research. She gave this acronym. It's entitled BRAVING. So cool. BRAVING. These are the things. I'm going to go through these really quick. They're going to be up there, and then Amy is going to move. But this is an acronym. These are 7 characteristics of what makes someone trustworthy, and I think it's helpful for us. BRAVING. Number 1, for BRAVING, boundaries. B is for boundaries. The person, whether they're trustworthy, is someone that should respect your boundaries, and vice versa, you should respect theirs. R is reliability. Do they do what they say they will do? Do they do what they say they will do? Are they reliable? Then A, accountability. Are they accountable? Meaning, do they apologize when they mess up? Are they accountable for their actions, right? V, I like this one, vault. Are they a vault? Meaning, when you tell them something, do you find out about that thing you told them from someone else a week later? This is whether someone is trustworthy, is whether these things stay. Again, that's why you start with a little. So you don't start with something that's really vulnerable, and you tell them about that, and then you find out a week later that Susie now knows about those things, right? A vault. Do the things you share with them stay with them? Are they a vault? I, integrity. Are they a person that have convictions? Do they live by values? Or do they just do what's comfortable? Because integrity is about living by convictions even though when it's not comfortable. Are they a person of integrity? Last 2, non-judgmental. Are they judging of others and yourself? So when they tell you about things, are they judgmental about it? Are they compassionate? Do they receive those things, or are they judgmental? And the last one, are they generous? Are they generous in their interpretation of you? Are they generous when they hear about those things that you share, especially those vulnerable things, those things that you don't want to share with other people? Brené says these things are the traits, based on her research, which makes someone trustworthy. meaning someone that you can be vulnerable with. So even right now, we all have different people we're thinking about when I say, is there someone you can trust? Just even make a mental note, start ticking about them. Maybe later you can show them your tally of what the areas that they need to grow in.
Jordan's all about the measurable achievables. So with trust, obviously, trust gives way to vulnerability. But I often find there's a bit of a wrestle, specifically as we talk about this question around, okay, so where do boundaries come in? If I'm supposed to be vulnerable and pouring out my guts,
Right.
what are the terms of engagement? So I just want to quickly touch on two aspects of this. One of them is engaging with others' vulnerability. And so both vulnerability and sacrificial love, when we don't have guardrails or safety nets around those, it can leave us like a little unsure of what we're aiming for, or where are the limitations there. And so it's really important to establish healthy boundaries. Be in braving, establishing healthy boundaries. And so it's like, who do I share what with? When, it's kind of all those things, but it's also like, you are the person who's pouring the coffee and somebody just comes up and just, I am like number one suspect for this, just as like, yeah, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. You're like, I don't have the emotional capacity for that right now. So sometimes it's both on the giving and the receiving end
Right.
that you're learning boundaries. So first, I want to just talk about what it is to engage with others' vulnerability. And that really has to do a lot with knowing ourselves. That when we know ourselves well, when we know what our limitations are, what our boundaries are, our sensitivities, when we have a really clear map of our own personal comfort zones and those kinds of things, we are much better to
Right.
engage with people and hold space for them when they are sharing vulnerable things or things that they're walking through. And that is not a one-size-fits-all. That is different for different people, much like the boundaries and the guardrails you would put up at a toddler play park are very different than when you go to a climbing gym. They're very different because of the age and stage of people. And so just to give you a quick example of this, for instance, as I've grown, I have really learned about myself that I'm a feeler. I'm a very empathetic person. And so with that comes, I often, I want to hold that space for people. But for me personally, it comes at a cost, because I absorb the feelings of others. I feel that heaviness, I take on their emotions. And I'm growing and I'm learning to like hold that out here. But part of that is knowing when I am in a good place to be able to hold that space for people. That depending on where my life is at, this might not be a time that I am able to really hold the appropriate space. And so as I've grown, it's been times where I've said, hey, today is not a good day. I really do want to talk about this with you, but I actually have some time on Tuesday. That would be a better time for me, that I can be a little bit more present with you in this moment. And so it's things like that as you know yourself, you are better able to show up for those around you as you are walking out a relationship built in vulnerability and trust, because they're trusting that when they share that with you, you are going to hold that well, like Jordan was just talking about. So it's really important to know yourself, know your own emotions, know your own limitations or boundaries or your comfort level. Some people love to share it all and hug it out, and other people are like, this is hard for me, so I'm going to have to take a lot of emotional energy to do
Right.
that. The second one is how to be vulnerable. And this is something that our lead pastor at our church that we were at previously so lovingly discipled and shared with me. As I said, I'm a feeler, I'm a sharer. You've probably heard me say something before. And he said to me one time, he said, Amy, there is a difference between being transparent and being naked. And I have thought about that over and over and over again, because I think it is a very wise gauge to what it looks like between who you share what with. I am a transparent person. I share lots of what's going on in my life. It's not hard for me to share. But there's only a few people that I'm going to be like that vulnerable and naked with. You don't walk around telling everybody everything. You also don't walk around naked. So it's a really,
We hope.
yeah, we're going to just leave it there. But Basically, the point being, see, this is what he meant, really, in this moment. But there is only the few people that I share those select tender things with. And so I think that really comes when we use that gauge and we are actually proactive in making a conscious choice of who are the people that I feel safe to share with, that it gives you permission that, okay, I don't need to share that with, the cashier because I'm going to call so-and-so because we have already prearranged or predetermined that this is a safe person for me who is happy and willing to hold that space. And so I believe that it is really important for us to be intentional with that. And I will tell you firsthand that to have those people in my life that they have given me permission and we have mutually agreed upon, and that is built on a relationship of trust, as Jordan said. It takes time. That there's my husband, there's my counselor, and then I have a few specific friends, one in particular that actually just recently we made the decision together that we're going to have a weekly phone call and hash out what's going on in our lives and just share that with each other and to be able to walk that through. And that is so incredibly beneficial to make that decision to have those people. So being vulnerable is a conscious choice, and to exercise good boundaries is to have predetermined. And as those relationships grow, you can step back or step forward, but I really don't suggest making that call right in the moment and then just bearing it all, that it's much better to decide, you've got those people ahead of time.
Yeah.
So how do you do that? 2 ways. One would be prayer and self-examination, that you are able to learn your own, both for the sharing and the receiving. You learn your comfort level. You learn where you need to work. Perhaps that's in prayer. Perhaps that's through a counselor. Perhaps that's through the guidance of those loved ones around you that can see your blind spots. And second of all, establish your people. Find those people. I'm going to just shamelessly plug small groups for a second. Small groups are an excellent petri dish, is what I'm going to say, that you begin to grow relationships. And perhaps that's a place that you're sitting in a living room and you've just really connected with somebody. And over time, that is a relationship that continues to develop to a place that you feel like, I trust this person and I've grown to know this person. And so that's a great place to start if you're thinking, there's nobody in my life that I really feel like I can be vulnerable with. So that would be what we would say around boundaries and vulnerability, that there's absolutely boundaries, but it is going to be different for every situation.
Yeah, it's really good. Great. You guys good? Nobody's good. Okay, we'll keep going though. Question number 2. What are some ways that your community can become more diverse? So again, if you haven't been here, these are all in response to the different series that we did, or different talks in this series. And so we did a whole thing about being a diverse community. So we encourage you to go online and watch that to have more of a context, but we're just going to elaborate on that. So I'll just acknowledge that I'm white, male, in my 30s, right? So I just want to put that out there when we start talking about diversity. And so I think there's lots that we could cover in this complex subject, but I just want to give one helpful application for us, I think, as a community, and that's really been something that I've even learning even in this past season. And so how do we become more diverse? One practical way is that representation is so important. Representation is so important. In fact, in our small group, so our small groups, what they do is we just kind of like apply what is discussed on Sunday into our lives. And as we were talking about diversity, an individual in a group was telling me how he was working at a Christian camp one summer. And at that camp, a black individual became a counselor. And through a conversation, the black counselor said to him, he's like, I never knew I could be part of this camp. I thought this camp was just for white people. And I was like so perplexed. In the 21st century, at a Christian camp, this black individual thought that this camp was only for white people. And so the guy said, why did you think that? Because I didn't see any black people here. So I thought it wasn't for me. And that was just such a great illustration to me that representation is really, really important. And when we talk about diversity, I'm not just talking about like race. I'm also talking about diversity in every aspect of life. For example, Amy and I are married, and we have kids. And so a lot of our communication and a lot of the application for us of the gospel in our lives is about being parents and being married. And so a lot of our examples, you even heard Amy when she went up here, she talked about our youngest not sleeping and how that was how she was like living that out. Meaning, we should have singles on the stage with mics talking about how the tensions they're living in and how they're applying the gospel in their life. In fact, on our lead team, we have a couple individuals that are single. And I think that's so helpful because there's a diverse perspective of what does it mean for us to live out this life in the contexts that are different. And so I think representation is not something that's just virtual signaling or just some token that we do saying that, oh, look at this. It's actually a way that we see the full expression of God. And it's actually the way that we learn from one another. And so there's many different ways that we do this, but I just think some subtle ways that we're just like stepping into. Even a couple weeks ago, it was Happy Lunar New Year. Lunar New Year. It was a couple weeks ago, I think. I can't remember. Anyways, we just made a simple announcement. Hey, Happy Lunar New Year. Sounds Lunar New Year? I didn't make the announcement. Someone else did. I had two individuals that came up afterwards and said, hey, thanks for that. Something small, right? When our first service here, we did a land acknowledgement. Over Reconciliation Day, we did a prayer of grief because we believe that we need to be part of that the church should be an active part in reconciliation with Indigenous. And so it's just like these simple things that we're doing, and they're not just for us that we should do them, but we just understand that for people, for individuals, and for diversity, representation is important. And so if all you hear is about married people living a married life, or for individuals from different perspectives of life, or different races and genders and all those things, we're limiting the full scope of what the gospel can do in people's lives. And so there's many ways we're going to get this wrong. And many ways we'll miss on different aspects, and we'll need to make adjustments. But we believe early as a church, like that's integral for us as we get started, is that we want to be a visible demonstration of what the kingdom of God looks like. We want to be a visible demonstration of what heaven looks like. And so we're going to work and we're going to wrestle in those tensions. Number three.
How can we practically show love to people who hurt us? Now, I love this question because I think it is absolutely the very practical application of sacrificial love.
Right.
Like, I want to love people well, but sometimes it's really hard. And sometimes it's hard because other people have made it hard. And so this is a really complex question, and so we're gonna start on the shallow end of this conversation, and we'll work our way to the deeper end. But for the first thing is on the simple level of somebody has offended you in some way, in action or in word or deed or that kind of thing, and I would say just as a like grab and go piece is that truly I believe the most honoring and the most loving response we can have is what Jesus lays out for us in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 18, and you can go ahead and look at those verses at another point in time, but it really is a step-by-step of just really how you would go about confronting an individual that has offended you. And if you're like me and you read through these verses and you think, wow, that's really great, and it's kind of like, go and have that conversation with them and let them know that they've hurt you, and then bring in somebody else if they don't listen. And I'm like, I love that, but I actually have a hard time when the server gets my order wrong. I eat it anyways because I don't really love confrontation, and so that's hard to do. And so I want to recognize that because I know I'm not the only one in this room. But again, a pearl of wisdom that came out of our small group this last week that I'm going to give all the credit to Noah Wade, but something he has said that has stuck with me, and it was one of those things I was like, that's a little bit convicting for me, is he was talking about sometimes the most sacrificially loving thing he can do is often he's not a confrontational person, and often he wants to just let it slide or whatever, but sometimes the sacrificial thing is to be uncomfortable and to have a confronting conversation. And often we really feel like, I don't want to rock the boat, I don't want to have a difficult, I just want things to be as they are. But actually, when we take a 360 look at that, we recognize that false harmony is not loving. Walking on eggshells and not being, fully vulnerable. It's vulnerable to say, hey, like being honest and say, when you said that comment, it actually was very hurtful to me. And that's a hard thing to do. It's not easy to admit that somebody hurt you. We want to go, oh no, it's fine, it didn't bother me, it didn't bother me. But for the first part is that it is an opportunity when you have that confronting conversation. You love them enough not to just let this slide and just continue to, this offense to seep into your heart. And second of all, it allows them to perhaps correct a behavior and make an amends with you and correct what they did in the first place. Because, there is oftentimes that people don't even realize that they've hurt you, or they think that it's, gone by and it's not a big deal. And so as I've learned, peacemaking is a very different action than peacekeeping. And we are called to be peacemakers. And so therefore, that involves even on the micro level of, those that have offended you. It is a much more loving option to be honest, and to be vulnerable, and to confront that offense in love. So that's where we're going to start with that. We're going to wade into this question on a little bit of a deeper level when we get a little bit further down, but ultimately we want to be people that are reconciliatory and that we're actually making space and making a place for offenses to be corrected.
Yeah, that's good. Question number 4, Math. How can you balance loneliness in a world where it seems like everyone has someone? How can you balance loneliness in a world where it seems like everyone has someone? So I want to just acknowledge, as we're doing a series that's all about the power of relationships and the significance of relationships, and how relationships are one of the greatest indicators of our happiness and fulfillment and so many health benefits for our life. When we talk about those, for some of us, we start to see the deficit in those areas. Maybe a relationship has ended. Maybe there's some grief. Someone's passed away. Maybe you've moved and some relationships have changed. Maybe there's been some tensions. Maybe there's a separation, a divorce, a breakup. Like, when we talk about relationships, I just want to acknowledge that for some of us, when we start having these conversations, you realize, oh, there's a deficit in that area for me. I think especially like the reality of loneliness is significant in Metro Vancouver. We've talked about that already, but Metro Vancouver has a higher ratio of people living alone and has a higher, when surveys are done, more individuals claim to be lonely in Metro Vancouver than other places in Canada and the world. And so I think this is a reality that we need to acknowledge and we need to speak to. As we talk about relationships, for some of us, we see like some of those deficits around that. I think especially around like being single, the church has not had a robust view for this. Sometimes your experience might be different, but sometimes churches can talk in a way that marriage is the pinnacle of life, and that being married and having kids, it's like the ultimate thing. Unless you are married and have kids, and you realize there's challenges. Anyways, but like sometimes churches can set it up in a way that like this is where you experience like complete flourishing, or this is the goal of life, or whatever. And I don't also think church does it, but I also think like culture and society as a whole does that. And they certainly elevate romantic love and finding that someone, and that love will be uncomparable to anything else. So I just want to acknowledge that the church hasn't always done a really good job in this area, and sometimes we don't even speak to it, or just maybe some of the undertones that you hear, especially if you're single, some of the undertones you hear maybe aren't really aligning with Scripture. Because if you read the New Testament, you'd see quickly that it has a lot to say about being single. It has a lot to say about relationships. Jesus himself, the archetype of what it means to be human. In other words, Jesus lived a life that we could never live. He lived a life that had no sin in it. So he lived the ultimate fulfillment of what it means to be human. And he experienced deep intimacy. He experienced vulnerability. He experienced all those things, and he was never married, right? And so I think there's availability for us that sometimes we overvaluate different aspects and we undervalue the part of social bonding, meaning the connections with other people. That's not just in a romantic, married, or in a romantic setting. And I think Scripture shows this over and over and over again. The church should be a place where people feel loved and accepted regardless of their relational status, regardless whether they feel like they have too many people in their life or not enough. The church should be a place that feels the New Testament imagery like a family, right? like a community, like a group of people that care and love for one another. And so I think there's ways that I think our community should and has been, but should like step into those things and function in that way. And also the reality is you might be married and it doesn't guarantee this type of relationships that we talked about, ones of intimacy and vulnerability, ones that have deep connection where you can feel like you be your true self. Marriage doesn't guarantee that. In fact, some people would talk about being in marriages where they felt like strangers. And resentment and bitterness would grow up, and the phrase, the adage of we drifted apart, right? And so proximity doesn't necessarily guarantee intimacy, right? And so there's an intentionality that has to happen in these different relationships and those things. I reached out to a couple of individuals this week that are single, and I asked them for some of their perspective. I gave them the question, and some of them, they went through like a journey with me via text message. But one of them, we kind of landed on this, and I'm summarizing a bit of that. But she talked about in many ways, positions of loneliness and those factors of loneliness drives me to spend time in Jesus' presence. And that in that surrender in his presence, I experience a love and I experience a sustaining presence like nothing else. I thought that was really beautiful. I think that the reality is there's an intimacy and there's a surrender in Jesus' presence that maybe there's some reality that I don't even experience it fully. And so in that, she experienced something that was deep and something that was loving. And so I just want to say, regardless of where you're at right now, sometimes we wait for a future version of life. Meaning sometimes we're waiting for those friendships or those types of friendships to happen or that person, that Mr. Right or Mrs. Right, or sometimes we're waiting for a future version of ourselves to step into deep relationships with others. But can I encourage you, no matter where you are, that to take a step, that right now in this season is the best time for you to invest in relationships with others. And again, filter everything like we're saying through all the filters that we're putting and the caveats that every context is different. But we shouldn't just wait for a certain type of life to happen before investing in the transformative work of friendship. And so that's why, like we said at the beginning of 2023, our hope is that you gain a couple good friends this year. Because we believe friendship and relationship has some of the greatest influence and transformative work. It's the way God made you this year. And so we want to acknowledge some of those tension points, those deficits that we feel, but we also want to encourage that there's an opportunity to take a step. And maybe you're married, and maybe that's just even in your marriage this year, and to dive deeper into that level of depth of relationship.
Yeah, that's good.
Thanks. I thought so.
You're welcome. Marriage, your own personal hype man.
Yes.
Or woman. So we're gonna end with our last question as I'm looking at our time here. Our last question, question 5. We're gonna pull that up there for you. But if we are called to love all people, can we love toxic people from a distance and still call it Christian love?
Oh, what a great question. Very curious how you're gonna answer.
Just want to remind us all, I am not an expert. However, we're going to end heavy. Time's up. Heavy but hopeful is the theme we're going to go for here. So I'm going to piggyback off of the question about how do we engage in sacrificial, loving relationship with those that have hurt us? Because I want to start with the caveat that we when we're talking about toxic people, I want to make a real. There's a reality that there are relationships and there's reconciliation and there's hurt and offense that are at a very serious and grave level. And there are those in this room that have experienced hurt that is either it's not appropriate for it to be perhaps confronted and et cetera, or it's not possible. And so I really want to first make reference to that there are those relationships that exist and those relationships and those realities that we are holding even in our different stories. Yeah. And so with that, just very quickly, because this isn't what this question is about, but I really do believe that there is a place and a space where that becomes a thing of sacrificially, you are beginning the journey, and it very much is a journey of forgiveness. And so that's not what we're talking about here, but I do want to make that caveat that we are not necessarily petitioning that every single offense is going to be able to be reconciled with an easy 1, 2, 3 in the Jesus Handbook. So that's really important to know, because I'm sure that there are those questions. But when we're talking specifically about can we still engage and can we love those that we would consider toxic? And just so that we're all on the same page, I want to define here. I Googled what is the definition of a toxic person, because I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just my own thoughts. But essentially, a person whose behavior adds negativity and upset to your life. So often those are people that they either consciously or unconsciously don't respect boundaries that you have put in place. Those are people that can potentially be manipulative, and I don't think I need to go on. I'm sure we all kind of have some taste or another of what a toxic personality looks like. But this really does bring up for some people a hesitation around sacrificial love, because I think these are the kinds of relationships that pop into our heads when it's like, we just need to love. That it's like, oh, but I have seen that go terribly wrong. I have seen that be manipulated. I have seen the idea of grace really becomes a lot more of like what I've heard, see grace, that it's not necessarily this full embodiment of a God that we get to see who is both love and just. And those two things are synonymous. We cannot separate a loving God and a just God, because he is the same. Yeah. And so those two things have to coexist, and they are intertwined together. So what I want to look at is that kind of that idea of like, how do I love somebody who is hard to love and continues to be a black hole of sacrificial love, that it's just never going to be enough. I'm going to actually just pour out myself until I am exhausted. And that really is a struggle when you're talking about this kind of personality. So first of all, I want to say if we're talking that, love and justice go hand in hand, justice is accountability, is what that is. There's accountability for actions. So justice is accountability, and therefore love is just. So if you've ever been to any kind of counseling, or you've had a friend that's been in counseling, the first thing you often learn when they've gone specifically in a relational context is the idea of the only person you have control over is you, yourself. Grade A for all of you, that you're all still awake as well. But ultimately, you are the only person you can control in any relationship. And so when it comes to, how does it look to interact with a toxic personality, ultimately it has very little to do with them and everything to do with you. And so when we talk about, these verses from Matthew or that kind of thing, it all has to do with your action. And if they don't respond, this is your next step and this is your next step. But it ultimately has to do with you. And so one of my favorite quotes of, you may have heard of Andy Stanley before. He's quite a prolific pastor, speaker, author. And in his book, Irresistible, there's a beautiful quote in there that often the question, we want to know a line. We want to know, okay, like when's enough? When is enough love for this person that I can cut them off because, I've tried to love them and they're really difficult to love, or they take advantage or whatever. The quote that he says is that often the measure is, what does love require of me?
It's a good question.
So when we're thinking about love is just, love holds accountability, all of these things, that is part of that. What does love require of me? And often, we just talked about how that is something in the form of a confrontational conversation. But also, sometimes that means it also comes down to boundaries, which we've already talked about. That sometimes you can love others best when you have strong, clearly communicated and perhaps re-communicated boundaries. Because there are going to be those individuals in your life that they are not going to create their own boundaries. It's not, you do have those people that are like, you know what, we've actually been here for 2.5 hours and it's probably time for us to go. And then you have other people that are like, we're all still sitting down, great, we can stay for another 6 hours. There's going to be people in your life who will not create and police themselves, so you are going to have to make those boundaries yourself. And I will give you a very clear example. I love looking at large cats. Jordan's mom worked at a zoo for years, and I don't mean like large cats, like obese house cats. I mean like lions or tigers or that kind of thing. Like chubby cats are great too, but that's not what I'm talking about. But you know what I really love? Is that I love that I can look at them, but there's a fence between us. I love large cats, but I love them better when I'm on one side of the fence and they're on the other, because I can appreciate them and I can see them, and they're not going to rearrange my face for me. So it's the same thing with toxic people, that there's going to be relationships in your life that sometimes it is
Right.
very difficult or impossible to cut them out of your life.
Yeah.
And when I say that, I don't say that lightly, because obviously there is relationships that do have to end, but you are an adult child with a parental relationship that is perhaps unhealthy, or vice versa, or there is people in your life that you feel it's not easy to cut them out of your life. But I'm going to tell you right now, good fences make good neighbors.
Right.
Good boundaries make good relationships.
Yeah, that's good.
And so there's going to be people in your life that you are going to have to engage with, and the way you can love them best is to be clear about your boundaries.
Yeah.
Because then it does not create resentment in you and they take advantage of you. You've laid out a boundary. And this is the marker. And if they continue to cross it, and then you pull your boundary back. And it's ultimately you've decided, okay, I have done what I can do. I can no longer do this. And it gives you these marks in the sand of, I don't think I can continue with this relationship. But I want to underscore that often these things are complex.
Right.
Often, it is really hard to make those decisions in a
Yeah.
vacuum. Sometimes the healthiest boundaries, both for Jordan and I, that we have had to set in difficult relationships, we have done with the help of our community in prayer, but also of a professional, of a counselor that's helping us work through those issues. So when you're dealing with difficult personalities or narcissistic personalities or toxic personalities, sometimes the best thing you can do is seek the help of a professional who's going to be able to help you create your boundaries and your rules of engagement with those people, so that you're able to love them at a healthy distance, because like it says in scripture, love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
And therefore you do have to love yourself and honor your boundaries and honor your people and your family.
Yeah.
So that's all encompassing in that love is just. And what does love require of me?
It's good. It's good. It's really
I
good.
feel passionate about that.
Okay, it's great. Thanks, Ames. We did it. Great. I think that's it.
That's it? That's all you
That's
want to
it.
say? That's
That's
all
it.
you got?
I'm gonna
Okay.
invite the team up.
Okay,
You
let's
can-
do
you
it.
can take a seat. Thank you.